Hey everyone, how's it going? I'm Ella Feingold. I'm an orchestrator. I hope you're doing really, really well. I'm joined today, as always, by my cat Mooney and my and my dear friend Brett Newton. Sorry, Mooney comes first.
Oh, yeah, of course, of course.
Yeah,
Mooney
Brett.
always comes when I am on audio with you for
Yeah,
whatever reason.
absolutely. Everyone loves Mooney and everyone loves Brett. Yeah, Brett is a dear friend of mine. Instrumentalist, a specialist in all kinds of obscure instruments. I will link his website below. And you've written how many books? Three, four?
Three orchestration books, working on fourth right now. I actually have more working on the second edition of volume one. But yeah, they're on wind band orchestration. The first modern textbooks on that subject. And it's been a big, long, fun project.
Yeah,
Got a lot of positive feedback on them, so that's good always.
awesome. Cool. So today, Brett and I were going to just discuss bassoon and some of the intricacies of the instruments and ranges and vibrato and all
Mm-hmm.
kinds of stuff. We're just gonna kind of riff. It's unscripted, and we're just gonna kind of converse about the instrument. And yeah, so I guess to get started, you want to show what it looks like to assemble the
Sure,
instrument.
sure. So yeah, I think we kind of want to talk bassoon basics. Um, I've got my bassoon here. I'm going to go ahead and assemble it. But really, the first thing to talk about, I guess, is the reed. This is a double reed. It's a piece of folded over cane, and this is what makes the sound on it. That is the actual appropriate sound that it the reed itself produces a multiphonic, and that's one of the reasons the bassoon has such a complex sound is the reed. That's what we call the crow. It is a multiphonic that starts the sound, and so the bassoon has this huge rich overtone series because of that. But let's go ahead and assemble the bassoon.
I wanted to ask you if it's okay before we even do that. I want to do a series of interviewing different players, and I guess one important question I would ask everyone is why you chose your particular instrument. Because I always feel like there's a psychology to
Oh
the
yeah.
instrument, and so it's just like, what is it that drew you to the bassoon?
So honestly, the reason I wanted to play bassoon was so that I could play the contrabassoon, which is of course even more obscure. So that is probably a very atypical answer, but I wanted to play contrabassoon because it was the lowest and the biggest instrument in the orchestra, and I was just immediately kind of drawn to it. It's like it is this mystery instrument. Back 25, almost 30 years ago, um, that you didn't hear it. It was even after saying I want to play the contrabassoon, I did not actually hear a contrabassoon for another 3, 4 years. So I wanted to play an instrument I'd never even heard, I'd only seen. So there is a deep fundamental flaw in my psychology there, obviously. But yeah, so I wanted to play the kind of weird, rare, obscure instrument, and in wind band, that's bassoon. It is kind of the most unusual, the most obscure instrument there. And to know that there's an even more obscure and unusual instrument in that family, that's kind of what drew me to it.
So,
And
was it about being the anchor of something?
no, it was about I
More the
think it was more
obscurity
about
rather than the sound production?
I think so. Yeah, just I was drawn into the rarity of it.
The rarity of it.
With
Okay.
yeah, so just you know, rarity breeds value. You kind of look at it from that point of view. But yeah, so that's kind of what drew me to it, and I've been fascinated with the instrument ever since. And that's been 25 and 30 years ago. God,
Wow.
I'm getting old.
Yeah. And you and I
But
were talking about, just I know this is a video on bassoon, but you and I were talking about contrabassoon and just the lack of pedagogy and
Yes.
teaching of the instrument, and I think it's sort of somewhat similar with contrabass, not that
Well,
there isn't pedagogy, but, not
well,
as much as
you know,
violin pedagogy.
what's interesting is that of all the orchestral instruments, contrabassoon has no formal pedagogy. And when I say none, I literally mean there is no formal pedagogy. Only within the last few years have there actually been classes you can take in contrabassoon performance. And that's mostly thanks to a few very dedicated performers. But before that, I mean, and this, we're talking within the last 10 years. Before that, you were just handed a contrabassoon, said, here's an old fingering chart, go learn. And that was it. You might be lucky to take one or two lessons on the instrument, maybe, but because of that, the contrabassoon, I think, really has suffered because people just never took it seriously. It is starting to change on that, but it's a very slow change. Anything in contrabassoon world is slow. People are still using 120-year-old instruments. So with woodwinds, that's ancient. People don't play on woodwinds that long, but with contrabassoon they do. So
Interesting. Cool. Thank you. Sorry for the little tangent, but
oh no, that's fine.
that was
Right.
important.
So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and put the bassoon together. The bassoon is in four main pieces. This here is called the boot or the butt. Every joint on a bassoon has two names. So this is the characteristic joint of the bassoon. It is where the air column folds over. It goes down this side, back up this side. It is what makes a bassoon a bassoon. This is the winged or the tenor joint here. This is the bass or the long joint. And of course, the bell. And lastly, we've got the bogle. This is what connects the instrument to the reed. It's actually probably the most important part of the bassoon after the reed. This will change how the instrument sounds. Mm-hmm. And one last little thing there. And then, yeah, got it all together. The bassoon is held in place by a seat strap that it goes under my legs above the chair. You can also play it with a neck strap. Neck strap is not as commonly seen in this country as it is in Europe. Most European players use it. American players use the seat strap. The seat strap has probably better ergonomics. The neck strap is more traditional, but all right. So got it all together. Let's. I'm just going to play a basic B flat scale. Yeah, let's start that over. I gotta get a few notes out first.
Awesome. So I wanted to talk about a couple of things for those that don't know. Can you explain where the sound comes out on the instrument and how miking the instrument is different from other woodwinds in terms of its projection?
Yeah, so we were talking about this the other day. Bassoon has a real issue.
Your audio's quiet for some reason now. I don't know why.
Give me a second. Let me.
I'm trying to think if I got any jokes to kill some time. It was fine before, but when you played, for some reason, it got like cut in half.
Oh yeah, probably.
If you can turn, I don't know if there's an ambient microphone setting or something like that.
Did that change anything?
No.
Yeah, lovely.
That was really weird that
It does that when you switch to music. Okay. Is my audio good now?
no, it sounds super distant.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know what happened.
Let me try something. Okay. I've switched over to headphones. Does
That
that make any difference?
that totally fixed it.
Okay. Let me play again. How's that?
It sort of I only got about 3 notes out of that.
Okay. Let's try again. Better?
No. Here, I'm going to cut the video off.
Okay.
Shit. Um Hey there, we're back. Sorry, we had some technical issues.
Yeah, for whatever reason, Zoom does not like playing music over it. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, let's try me playing that B flat scale one more time.
Yep.
Uh,
And so what I was saying was just if you could explain for those that don't know where the sound comes out on the instrument.
Okay, so yeah, bassoon is one of the more difficult instruments to mic, as we kind of just found out
Yeah.
with our audio problems. Um, the sound will come out depending on which note you play from anywhere on the instrument. So anywhere up here from the top of the bell, all the way down here to the bottom of the boot. It just depending on what's the nearest open tone hole. So you've got about 4.5 feet of distance that the sound can come out of. So the microphone on a bassoon needs to be placed a little bit away. Unfortunately, on a lot of recording studios, they want to put the mic really close to it. And so you're going to get a very unbalanced sound. Contrabassoon is even worse. Contrabassoon is probably the most difficult instrument to mic because of that.
Gotcha. And, can you talk about? I mean, I think it might be obvious for those listening that, the scale towards the very bottom of the instrument has a lot of bite and projects. And then as soon as it gets into the bass clef, or inside the bass clef, rather, that, it starts to lose some of that bite and point,
Yeah.
and
So
then it becomes sweeter. And for those that don't know, as an orchestrator, a lot of times when the bassoon, if it's in its lowest B flat to say F sharp, it really projects down there. But inside the bass clef, putting two, or even putting a bass clarinet with the bassoon really helps the instrument project more.
So I think some of that could be just microphone settings as well, too, as we're talking. Uh, in reality, the lowest notes are not that much louder than the middle notes. I've actually put a decibel meter on here, And I can play the low B flat as loud as I can play the high B flat. What's happening though, as you go higher and higher, the lower harmonics are being suppressed. So
Yeah.
you're not getting the same richness. The bassoon has a fundamental scale of an octave and a half. Its actual fundamental scale is F Lydian. That's the fundamental scale of the bassoon. It's what we refer to as a hard scale because it's got the raised fourth. Anything below F is an extension. So E down to low B flat, that is an extension off of the main scale.
Mm-hmm.
So those notes are all outside of the fundamental range. Even though no bassoon player actually thinks of it that way, they just think, oh yeah, it's a low B flat, whatever.
Sure.
So up to open F. So open F is F3, the F in the bass clef. That is the highest note that is a fundamental or a first harmonic. Everything above F3 is a second harmonic or higher.
Yeah.
So I go F to F sharp. You should be able to hear a pretty drastic tone color change. That F sharp is a particularly bright note. It's the lowest second harmonic I've got. And what's happening is the F comes out here. The F sharp comes out down here.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually on the upswing here, so it's even further away.
Gotcha.
So
Yeah, I think what it is it just loses its bite inside the bass clef.
Oh yeah. So particularly above that F sharp, you're going to lose some of that bite, and it gets a little bit more singing. Whereas if I play the same thing down an octave, those are the same fingerings. It's just I'm overblowing the upper notes so that the second harmonic comes out. Just like if you're playing a harmonic on a guitar, it's got a much thinner sound. That's how all woodwinds work, is that the second register is the second harmonic. Or if you're dealing with clarinets, third harmonic, because of the lack of the even number partials. So the second harmonic is always going to have a little bit of a softer sound because it is lacking that fundamental pitch. So instead of having your harmonic series, you're just having. So you've dropped off that first octave.
Gotcha.
In harmonics.
Could you demonstrate, the A or the B flat, but right below middle C to however high you feel like playing? I just want students to understand how beautiful the bassoon is in that register.
Yeah. So this is just what we would call tenor B flat. It's B flat 3. So that range from like B flat 3 up to G4 is what bassoon players we call that our money register. All of our big solos are really kind of in that register.
So for students or beginning orchestrators, try and internalize what Bret just played and try and internalize what that would have sounded like on a cor anglais, an English horn versus bassoon, and try and visualize or internalize, which color would be right, to me, bassoon there's it's more tender, it's sweet, where English horn could be a little more melancholy. It sort of reminds me of like a bigger person and they're trying to talk and they get a little choked up. I don't know why. It's just
when I'm teaching orchestration, one of the teaching bassoon, the very first thing I will tell a beginning orchestrator is this is not a bass instrument. Despite it having the name bass in it, it is not a bass instrument. It is a tenor instrument. And that is the role it fulfills best. Not to say it cannot be a bass instrument, but it really, the modern bassoon is so much more of a tenor singing voice.
Yeah.
A
I try
Baroque
and tell
bassoon,
students that like to score read Pelléas and Mélisande just because like the bassoon parts are pretty much in tenor clef like the whole opera,
exactly, yes.
you
And
know.
so bassoon players, professional bassoon players, kind of are protective of tenor clef. We kind of really like it and taking it as our own. It's like, yeah, tenor clef. Why can't you read tenor clef? You look at trombone players or look at other instruments like
Yeah, that's a,
tenor clef.
trombone is a problem too with some composers and some beginning orchestrators where they think
Mm,
that's a bass instrument as well. And
right, right.
if you look at Ravel or someone like Bruce Broughton, I mean, when you see the scores, the instrument's written in tenor clef. I mean, it just shows you how
Exactly.
they're thinking about the instrument, that it's
Yeah,
a
yeah.
tenor instrument.
You think about a lot of your great bassoon solos from orchestral literature. Most of them can be written in tenor clef. There's only one, two really. One is Prokofiev's uh, Peter and the Wolf, and that's it's as characteristic as that is for bassoon. It's actually pretty unusual for us.
It
When
sounds more like a contrabassoon or a sarrusophone just with the
right,
buzz, you
right.
know.
Okay, so let's talk about that particular note. That's low B natural. This is a this is a unique note on the bassoon, and I hate using that word, but in this case, it's true. Low B natural. That's B flat, B natural one, and this is the case with all conical reed instruments. The second to lowest note always has this little bit of a snarling quality to it. Bassoon is the most pronounced. Saxophone, not as much. Oboe, not as much. But bassoon, the second to lowest note, snarls. So I can play the notes right next to it. And you can hear
Yeah.
the C is a much smoother sound, but that B natural is tough. I'm looking around to see if I've got something. It's in the other room. One of the worst things that we've seen as bassoonists is the end. I can't remember which movement it is in Tchaikovsky 5. He has the first bassoon on a pianissimo, triple piano, low B. It's just damn difficult to do that and get it smooth and out of the texture. Um, so it's a very tricky piece of orchestration there. But that note in particular, B natural one, is really bright. It's got a big snarl to it. The other notes that are going to have that are all of your F sharps. Those have a real bright quality to them. The notes right next to them, perfectly fine and smooth. But F sharps are a little brighter. A good
Okay.
bassoon player will be able to temper those. So I mean, I've got some false fingerings I can use if I really need to. It does affect the tuning though, and that's where it gets a little more tricky.
Okay. Can we talk about vibrato on your instrument?
Sure.
Non-vibrato, a classical vibrato, a more jazz-like vibrato. If you
Okay.
can demonstrate the different techniques,
Sure.
and if you can also talk about if there are any ranges on the instrument where you apply more or less vibrato. Like a lot of students don't know sometimes in the lowest range of some instruments that you don't really play with vibrato.
Right. Okay. So vibrato on contrabassoon is not a universal. Unlike instruments like flute and oboe, where you pretty much use vibrato all the time, unless you're doing something that specifically says non vibrato or you're doing Baroque or classical music, where it's generally not appropriate.
Hmm.
They use vibrato all the time. Bassoon, on the other hand, I can just equally play with vibrato or without. Uh, so that's without. That's with. Um, there are several different ways to do it. I remember reading a study years ago where they polled different bassoonists around the country, and I think maybe around the world, about how do you produce vibrato, and it was actually really pretty mixed. So no two bassoon players are going to produce a vibrato exactly the same way. You can do it with a diaphragm vibrato. Well, I say diaphragm, it's really abdominal, where you're just doing quick contractions of your abs. That gets a real strong pulse. You can also do it with the jaw.
And the jaw,
Um,
is that more of the jazz?
that yeah, you see a lot of players who do a lot of saxophone will
Right.
do the jaw. I tend to do a little combination of both. So I have a little bit of the jaw going, a little bit of the diaphragm, and I kind of can mix it in between.
Yeah, the jaw vibrato's got that old school
Oh yeah,
1940s
yeah,
kind of.
yeah.
For those that don't know, Brett also plays sax. So, would you
Yeah.
say that the only people that would play with jaw vibrato are people that also play sax or have a
No,
jazz
no,
background?
no. You will see jaw vibrato fairly frequently, I think. And other bassoon players may disagree on that point. But yeah, it's a very very subtle. In fact, it's not so much in the jaw; it's almost in the lip. So your jaw's really not moving much. It's just slight movement. It's not big.
Okay.
And
Maybe another
a
thing
lot
to.
of vibrato. Oh,
Oh,
I
go
was
ahead.
gonna say a
Sorry.
lot of vibrato is really just feel over technique, and it's one of those after you don't even think about it after a while. You just kind of to do it.
So
Um,
when you see a low B flat whole note versus a B flat inside the bass clef,
I'm
are
probably
you
not going
instinctually going to apply more or less vibrato on a certain note? Just
I'm
what
probably not going to put much, if any, vibrato on a low B flat. So something to think about with low notes is the lower the note, particularly if it is the base of the chord, you don't generally want to put vibrato on that because
right,
everybody else needs to tune to you.
right.
If your pitch is going up and down, it becomes much more difficult for everybody to tune. And in fact, I don't even know if you could hear the vibrato when I put it on that note because
Yeah,
those
you
vibrations are getting a little slower.
no, you definitely can hear it, and that's a really good point that you're anchoring a chord. And so when you even think about pop music, I mean, a bass player's not going to vibrato a note. It's going to be
Right, unless they're taking a solo.
right or playing fretless bass
And
or something. But
yeah, when I was studying contrabassoon, my contrabassoon teacher basically said I never played with vibrato at all on contrabassoon, except in the very rare contrabassoon solo, which you may get once a season.
so would you advise students that don't want vibrato to sort of only mark it when it's in a more tenor register and not worry about marking non-vibrato in the bottom octave?
For a composition student, I don't really think you need to worry about it too much, honestly. If the only time I would actually mark vibrato or non-vibrato is if it's against characteristic. So if you want a just a real dead sound, that I would mark non-vibrato in the tenor register.
Gotcha.
Um, I can't remember the notes, but that's type four, and it just sounds dead and cold. Whereas something like that, yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I
when
don't know
you
what you
want
would call
that
that.
sort of organ, pipe organ sound,
Right, right.
non-vibrato with clarinets completing, the upper notes of
Mm-hmm.
the chord
Yeah.
like
So
Ravel
playing
does.
with clarinets is bassoons play with clarinets a lot, and we really have to listen to our clarinet brethren and say, okay, do I use vibrato to match them, or to not match them? Because clarinets in most countries don't use vibrato. They will use it in Eastern Europe, and you'll hear
Yeah.
that. So it depends on where you're performing. But here in the United States, clarinet players don't use vibrato outside of jazz. Um, so if I'm having to blend in with the clarinets, I'm not going to use vibrato. If I'm blending with the flutes or the oboes, I will. If I'm blending with the strings, I will. If I need to blend with the horns, I won't.
And that's
So my
why,
job as a bassoonist is to listen to see how I blend in.
right. And just as a sidebar, for those listening, for concert music, that's fine. You don't need to mark some of these things because you're rehearsing and people get a sense of where they fit in the music after the first read. But with, film and video game music, they don't. So that's why we will write, for you as your sight reading with clarinets, color
Yes.
horns, so they get it. They get it. Oh, okay. I'm adding projection to the horns. Oh, I'm completing a clarinet chord. And so to not play vibrato. And that's just, if you ever see scores of films and video games and stuff like that, that's why you will see that a lot because they immediately know who to blend with.
Right, and that's really effective for striping sessions, which you do a lot,
Yep.
where you may not have those other instruments in the room.
Yep.
Bassoon is really a chameleon instrument. I know it gets talked a lot about like being the clown of the orchestra, but really this is a great blender. It blends with almost every instrument
Yeah.
um,
I mean, it's like
because of
three
its
different
complex nature.
instruments.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, so two bassoons can easily become horns 5 and 6, or
Yeah.
they can become oboes 3 and 4, or they can become clarinets 3 and 4.
Or
In
flute
fact,
three, up high.
exactly, yeah. So if you go up into the high register, bassoon and flute combinations are very, very common, particularly in the very high register of bassoon. And we haven't even discussed the high register.
Yeah. How about if you could just demonstrate just articulation? I mean, I know you like to say bassoon is king of staccato.
Yes, the
And
only instrument that can match us staccato wise is a xylophone.
so could you maybe just with the B flat scale?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, it's just that because of the nature of the double reed, it can produce this very quick, uh, terse sound. Clarinets do not have nearly the same quickness to response that the double
Right.
reed will. Case in point, I was playing in a recent wind band concert, and I was sitting next to the bass clarinet player, and I could always notice that my sound spoke much much quicker than his sound, and that's partly just due to the acoustics of the instrument. That the bassoon is a very quick speaking instrument, whereas clarinets are fairly slow.
Yeah.
This is something that orchestrators, I think, really need to know. Bassoon is an on or off instrument. There is no fader knob to just bring it in and bring it down.
Right.
It's either on or off. There's no niente on any double reed.
Yep.
It is an impossibility. The double reed will not allow it. There are some tricks you can do, but starting a note from nothing is impossible.
Right.
Let me see if I can even attempt it. Kind of just. You see, it's got this hesitant start.
Yep.
Most of my notes, I will start with an attack from the tongue. So I'll say ta. As you see, there's a very, very clear beginning of that note. Oftentimes, what you will find is bassoon music where they want the bassoons to be just an extra clarinet and writing this pianissimo texture. It's like, okay, that's not happening. It's 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 clear, it's precise. Um, this is it's a great tool. In what the bassoon does is it gives clarity to the beginning of notes for instruments that wouldn't necessarily have that clarity. Particularly strings. Strings do not have a real clear beginning to their note. Put a bassoon or an oboe with that, and you're going to get a very clear
Yeah.
beginning to that note.
Yeah, I think of them as the pecking instruments, and when you need
Yes, yeah.
the sharp points in the jab, you call on bassoon and phone and contrabassoon and oboe and
Mm-hmm.
cor anglais. And when you want more of a foof or a fluffier sound, flutes and clarinets. I mean, for my video game scoring gig for one of the companies I work for, they want everything like militant, tight, and it's
Mm-hmm.
like sometimes just because it's fortissimo, we have to use the clarinets for some of these pecking gestures, and I even mark clarinets as staccatissimo, just like please as short as possible because it's just,
Right.
and that doesn't mean
It
that it necessarily can do it, but it's just giving them a fighting chance of understanding how quick, you know, the release, how quick to get off of the note. Like it really needs to be tight.
Right, and a bassoon staccato is usually going to be much tighter, much crisper than a clarinet's.
Yeah, I mean, it can be like a Barry sax almost.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, yeah. In fact, it's quicker than a Barry sax. So I could go get my Barry sax right now, and I cannot get as quick of an attack on the Barry sax as I can on bassoon.
Yeah. Let's jump to another topic. I don't want to spend too much on this, but
Okay.
I know a lot of times, people talk about multiphonics. And for me, as a
Sure.
working orchestrator, dealing with musicians that are sight reading music, I just choose to write, use your best multiphonic or your loudest
Yeah.
multiphonic. I just wonder really quickly, could you just explain why it's better to notate something like that for film and game, not concert music or solo bassoon,
Okay.
can you
Yeah.
just explain
So
why it's safer to write something like that?
So each instrument's going to respond differently. There are some multiphonics that will work on nearly every bassoon. My favorite is the D major chord. So I can play. And that's actually a kind of a nice sounding multiphonic. Um, and that's an actual harmonic progression there.
Hmm.
What 1 4 5 1. But conversely, there are some. If you want a much more harsh sound, I might do something. And I might experiment with some of those. And basically, all I'm doing is I'm playing a low note and I'm venting in a place where it's not supposed to be vented. When I say venting, in order to go up an octave or up a 12, I have to vent somewhere. It means opening up a little hole somewhere in the instrument so that acts as a harmonic node. So, for instance, C in the staff, C3, I'm I've got a little touch right here that's about at the halfway note, and I can go up the octave. Well, if I'm playing that low B flat, what I'm doing is I'm opening up a node that
Sounds like a
is
seventh
not.
chord.
Yeah, almost. And that's me just moving the node up and down. And I
Mm-hmm.
can change the multiphonic there. Bassoon does multiphonics supremely well because, one, the note is started with a multiphonic on the reed. Two, the tone holes are all undersized for the instrument. So the tone holes are usually very small, and they're all at weird, funky angles. So it's not an acoustically perfect instrument. Surprisingly, contrabassoon does not do multiphonics well at all because it does not have those funky angled holes and undersized. The contrabassoon's tone holes are all about correctly sized. So contrabassoon does not do multiphonics very well.
Okay. Could we talk about real quick just Timbrel Trills?
Sure. So we don't see timbrel trills a lot in bassoon music. What a timbrel trill is basically you play a note and then you mess with some keys below that in order to change the timbre. So, for instance, I'm going to play an open F, and I'm just putting. So, open F means no fingers are down, and I'm just moving fingers down here. There does come a point when timbre trills are impossible. Any note below low F, that is the lowest note I can do. Well, I could do a timbre trill on low E as well. But any note below that, I cannot do a timbre trill on because all the keys are right here and they're all interconnected. So if I press them down, they're going to press all the others down, and it just, instead of a timbre trill, it becomes a tremolo. So not.
So for those that would wonder why the hell would you ever write a timbral trill, it's like if you can picture on a stringed instrument stopping, the same note on adjacent strings, that there's just,
Mm-hmm.
one string has a little more focus, one has a little more body. So if you're writing music where you're playing around with one note, that's a way, a false way of creating motion. And just a little bit of nuance to a single note.
The open players are often going to think of something like that more as what we would call a mechanical vibrato. Um, it is something you'll see recorder players do a lot. It's basically just a mechanical vibrato. And so instead of doing the vibrato with the mouth or the air, you're doing it with the fingers.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. How about, I know we've spoken about this before, but Flutter Tongue.
Okay, so first off, not everybody can flutter tongue. A certain portion of the population cannot roll their R's, and so this has to be taken into account. By and large, the people who can't roll their R's we find to be East Asian descent as well as English descent. English does not have a rolled R in the phonemes. A rolled R is brr. People of Spanish descent, German, great. They all have that uh, in their phonemes. You don't, like I said, you don't see it in East Asian languages either. Um, so people of English descent, which is a large portion of the American population, um, a lot of times have a real hard time with flutter tonguing. There are two ways of doing it. You can, one, roll your R, brrr, or you can do the glottal stop, which is much more aggressive. It doesn't give you quite the same sound, but it can work. I can flutter tongue, and it's one of those things. I've been able to flutter tongue nearly as long as I've been playing the bassoon. Something to think about with flutter tongue is it is a very aggressive sound. I've seen younger composers write flutter tongue and then try and write something delicate. It's like, no, that's not how it works. Flutter tonguing can only be done at like a middle dynamic and up. It's not something you're going to do at a lower dynamic level because you do have to increase the air pressure to keep the tongue moving. So there's a minimum dynamic, and it's really about mezzo forte. Um, you might get away with mezzo piano, and then because bassooning is a little bit of a softer instrument, it can kind of hide in larger textures. But I mean, it's still going to be fairly prominent.
A couple of other things, sometimes orchestrators write gradually to flutter tongue, and can you talk
Oh
about
no,
why that's
obviously.
not? Yeah, can you
You
explain why
you
that's not?
can't. It's a physical impossibility of the tongue. The tongue can't go.
Yeah,
If
it's
you
an on or
if you can't
off.
even say it, you can't
Yeah,
play it. So yeah, it is absolutely an on or
yeah,
off.
there is no gradual to flutter tongue.
Mm-mm.
Can you talk about the lowest register and why it's, impossible or just painful with it vibrating your skull with flutter tongue?
Oh, I can do it. I can do it, but I cannot see you.
I was
So
gonna say your teeth aren't rattling
no,
around.
yeah, everything is rattling. I can do it, but I just can't focus.
Yeah.
What's happening is particularly like that low B flat. I'm getting two competing vibrations going on at the same time, and they're getting closer and closer in pitch to one another. There's a point on contrabassoon when you can't even tell that you're flutter tonguing because the vibrations basically will line up.
So would you
Um,
say it's important for beginner orchestrators to know that if they're writing flutter tongue in the low range and someone needs to sight read the page, that that
um,
that could be an issue seeing the notes?
a bassoon player is going to get over it, and
Yeah.
they'll be able to do it. It may take a little bit.
Yeah.
It is more difficult to flutter tongue down there because of the air pressures involved. It's low. The low notes have a low air pressure, but to flutter tongue you have to have a high air pressure. So
Mhm.
there's a real balance that you have to strike. And down there, it is a really, as you can tell, it's a really ugly sound.
Yeah.
It'd be great for monster movies, um, but I mean, do not expect beautiful sounds.
Okay. How about length of breath? A lot of times
Oh
beginning
yeah,
orchestrators forget to put in breathing.
you
Um,
know. So we really don't care. We're going to find a place to breathe. Um, I don't even worry so much about breath marks in my music. Um, it, music for woodwinds should come to you as naturally as singing does. The big difference is that our breath can last twice as long as a singer. So I'm just going to play a middle C, C4. I'm just going to show you how long I can go. still have half a tank of air left. The
Yeah.
problem is the air is all depleted of oxygen by that point.
I just wanted to say
So
for students and beginning orchestrators, just know that if you're doing stuff like that, give them time to recover and breathe
yeah,
for whatever's next.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, that gets me into a huge pet peeve of mine. I saw this on the last wind band concert I played. I would have entire pieces of music, multiple pages, where I don't have a bar of rest. Wind players have to have a few bars of rest every now and then just to allow the muscles to unclench. So these muscles right here is the orbicularis oris. It is the very, very tiny little muscles, and we are constantly having them in tension as we play. So if these muscles just are constantly tense, after a while they're going to wear out. And we need a little bit of recovery time to just release, relax, and just give us a few bars of rest here and there. But no, I've had pieces where I play every note of the entire thing, and it's like at the end, and it's not. That's the big thing that we hate, as opposed to it's like, oh, put a breath mark in. I don't care about a breath mark. I can sneak a breath wherever. I can't just lay out to let my embouchure recover.
Mhm. Okay.
So that's the bigger concern is no wind player can play indefinitely. String players can because they're using big, powerful muscles. We're using tiny, tiny, little, delicate muscles that wear out very quickly.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's a very important consideration, just the physicality, and that's why I wanted to, talk to you today so people have an intimate sense of, how bassoonists think and the physicality of the instrument, what goes into playing that actual note, and how fatiguing it is. Um,
Right.
could we talk about leaps on the instrument? I mean, I tell
Okay, sure.
students to be mindful with leaps, especially with strings, but can you maybe talk about how some of those things aren't as important on bassoon, or how it's easy to leap around the instrument and octave
Oh yeah.
leaps?
So yeah, leaps are like our bread and butter. We do that all the time. I mean, the 2 octave jumps, nothing. 3 octave jump. Yeah.
And
So
how
yeah,
about
because of how the acoustics work on here, I'm not having to move very far at all.
in a more legato sense? If I'm thinking, I forget what Ravel concerto it was, but and it was, I believe, for the oboe or English horn. But it's like octaves going up. Can you explain if it's equal up, coming down?
Okay, so yes, so there is a passage in Symphony Fantastique. It's just octave G's under a slur. Going up is always easy. Going back down, you
Yep.
can't slur down from a second harmonic to a first harmonic. It's a physical impossibility. I mean, you can kind of fake it, but what most bassoon players are going to do is do a very light articulation. It's you just have to basically get the note to re-speak because you've already split the harmonic. A split harmonic doesn't want to be unsplit.
Gotcha.
If it were a step lower, I'm not crossing the harmonic break. But because it is G to G and it crosses a harmonic break, it becomes much, much more difficult.
Speaking of harmonics, with oboe and flute, I write them just for a tone color, but on say oboe, they'll use them just for fingerings they'll use them, when they need to produce a very quiet note that might be, not naturally available at a certain dynamic. Can you talk about if harmonics are available on your instrument and if you use
They
them?
they somewhat exist, but we don't use them
Yep.
because the bassoon's harmonic spread, for whatever reason, is off. So what should be a 12 sometimes turns into an 11th or a 13th. So there's only two really reliable harmonic notes, and those are two notes, B3 and C4. I can play as harmonics, and those are really the only two. So I can play a C4. So that's the harmonic, and that's regular. And same
Right.
with
It
B3.
just takes some of the mid range.
But those are really the only two um, notes that work really well as harmonics. And with a limitation of two notes and a minor second, it harmonics on bassoon really just are not a thing.
Mhm.
Because to do the C sharp right above it, it's actually a supremely complicated note, and it's actually one of our standard fingerings. So I could play C sharp, so that's a standard second harmonic. That is a complex third harmonic, but it's a complex third harmonic based on F and not F sharp, which gets really confusing. So my basic fingering is F, but it's so sharp that it's coming out as a C sharp.
Gotcha.
And that's when things start breaking down.
Okay. I mean, we've talked a lot about a lot of different topics. I mean, is
The
there
only thing we
anything
have not covered, I think, really is the high range.
Sure.
Because
Okay.
I haven't really played anything above a high B flat. And that's a really very comfortable note. That's B flat 4, it's B flat in the treble clef. But there's still another half octave to go above there. And I think a lot of younger composers are kind of scared of this range. Um, they're all, hear horror stories about the rite of spring. The rite of spring is not a difficult note. That's C5. It's not a difficult note. What makes that passage difficult is you have to come in out of nowhere, and there's nobody else supporting you. But C5 itself is not a terribly difficult note. I mean, I can play that note all day long. It it's just the starting out of nothing
Hmm.
that Stravinsky wants is what becomes difficult. C sharp, same. D, not terrible. Now above D, it does get a little trickier. E flat, a lot of bassoon players will say, yeah, E flat's about the top. You can hear the start is much less crisp than the D. A lot of times it helps to slur from the D to the E flat. Above E flat, so that's F5. That's the top F at the treble, top of the treble clef. That's the highest note that appears in symphonic literature. You really, the only time you ever have to play that note is the symphonic dances from West Side Story. Um, and even then, many bassoon players will take it down an octave because they just do not want to play that high F. Above high F, you will very rarely see notes up there. F sharp. So that's A flat 5. That is the A flat right above treble clef. That's the note that I do not actually recommend that note. G is okay right below it. The F sharp is actually really pretty difficult. But if you're writing up there, you better be a bassoonist.
Yeah, I was gonna say
That's
I try not to write above the D, just for safety
right.
recording purposes.
Yeah. You can write to an E flat, should not be much of a problem. And the reason you can do the E flat is fingering wise, this is D. It's third finger, and then this pinky here. And then to get E flat, you just add these two keys, which are on every bassoon. So it's just as simple as da 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 da. That's not a huge step. Um, Once you get above there, you may run into the issue where some bassoonists may not have the key for the high E. If
Hmm.
they do, it's again very simple. You just add that key to that basic fingering. But it's not a universal key. It's becoming more so, but it's not yet.
Gotcha. How about repertoire? Like, could you explain to people what, I'm sorry, not repertoire, but what you practice? Are you practicing scales, arpeggios? What are the things in the pedagogy?
Oh yeah, so I mean, yeah, it's all scales and arpeggios. We've got a couple just big books that we go to. They're just etude books, the Weissenborn and the Milday. Uh, there's two Mildays. One's concert etudes, and one's scale etudes. And if you can get through and play all of those between those three books, you can play pretty much anything that gets thrown at you. I mean, there are other etude books, of course, but those are the big three that everybody uses.
Okay.
Um, but
I
yeah,
can
if you
put
can,
those in a link in the
yeah,
description below as well.
yeah, Weissenborn and Milday. They're both 18th century tutors, or 19th century, I should say. Um, and so bassoon players actually don't really have anything really modern in in standard repertoire. Um, we don't see a lot of pedagogy for more modern techniques, more extended techniques. Perhaps that is something that does need to change. Um, but a lot, so much of the stuff we do is ensconced in the 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s. So we don't see a lot of it.
Yeah.
But one thing to note on when we're talking about that high range, a lot of people think that high range is a really pretty new thing. It's not. We had composers writing the high D's all the way back in 1812. The very first fingering chart for the Heckel bassoon, maybe 1820 something, 1827, right? The same year Beethoven died, would have the high A flat in it. So these notes are not out of the ordinary. We have seen them for almost 200 years.
Yeah.
Not every bassoonist is prepared to play them, but they have existed for nearly 200 years.
Speaking of the Heckle system, could you talk about the difference between the French bassoon and the German in terms of sound
Sure.
production and
Yeah.
rarity? And
So you are pretty much never going to see a French system bassoon. They are nearly extinct. There might be 200 players worldwide that still play it.
Mhm.
Um, they're very rare. I have a good friend who does play French system bassoon, but he does that because he likes being a little eccentric. Um, but yeah, so French system bassoon is the instrument obviously used in France, and it was universally used in France until probably about the 1960s. The 1960s seems to be when a lot of traditions got changed in France. Um, but it is a very different sounding instrument. It is a different bore structure. It's I can't even remember if it's a wider bore or narrower bore. But one of the things with its structure is it plays the high notes much easier. So you see all of these French excerpts staying in this very high register. It's why we have these high E's in Ravel. It's Stravinsky was writing for the French bassoon,
Yeah.
so it's one reason we've got the right spring up where it is. So it is a very different instrument. I have tried playing French bassoon before. I cannot do it. It is a completely different fingering system. It's a different reed. Um, superficially they look very similar, but fundamentally they are very very different instruments. The German bassoon, which 99% of the world plays, is a pretty radical departure from the classical bassoon. That's the bassoon that Mozart and Beethoven would have known. The French bassoon is just the modern evolution of that classical bassoon. It is still very much an old instrument, rooted in. It's what I like to refer to as a kludge. It works because it works. It has had the Great Reformation, and the German bassoon had some of it. It probably needs another Great Reformation, just because it is such an archaic instrument. It doesn't do a lot of things naturally that the other woodwinds do easily. A lot of your octave changing and octave venting is very, very difficult on this instrument. But French bassoon is even older and, in many ways, a more difficult instrument. French bassoon is very difficult to play in tune. And the players that can do it are phenomenal. They have this incredible technique. A lot of times when people hear a French bassoon, they almost think it's a saxophone because it is very, very reedy. If you think that the German bassoon is a reedy sound, the French bassoon is much, much more so.
Interesting. Is there such thing as a French contrabassoon?
Yes and no. So French contrabassoons are German contrabassoons with French keywork. So they have the exact bore of a German contrabassoon, but they've put on French style keywork so that they can use it. They have not been made in a few decades. So nobody makes a French contrabassoon anymore. If you need a contrabassoon, that now they are all German system. You can occasionally find a used French contrabassoon on the market. There's not a high demand for them, and they still sell for astronomical prices.
So why is it with oboe that it's, a French oboe? It's the French school of playing, but with the bassoon that never carried over. Just that they're both
Um,
double reeds.
so with in the U.S. we've got French system of flutes, oboes, clarinets, and saxophones. Saxophones never had a German system, but the others did. What was found is that those produce sound evenly, and uniformly as a woodwind can. The French bassoon did not. The French bassoon was the most uneven of the French instruments. And the German bassoon was much more even, and it was much simpler to play because it had a little bit more logical keywork to it. It was not as dependent on the very fine intricacies on the reed. French bassoons are notoriously reed dependent, meaning that a bad reed will make you sound bad. Whereas a bad reed on a German bassoon, you might be able to get by with it. And they were more difficult to maintain. So everybody in the U.S. plays French instruments except for bassoonists who
Mhm.
play the German system, and it's kind of an unusual situation there.
It is, yeah. Are you able to pinpoint roughly what time that happened?
About 1920.
1920.
So you would see French bassoons in the U.S. probably up until about 1920,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of it just I think had to do with what they could get, what they could import. The French manufacturers weren't making a lot of bassoons, whereas there were a lot of bassoon makers in Germany, so they could get the German bassoons a lot easier. And the German bassoons tended to be better made. You had Heckel making, still making the Rolls Royce of bassoons. the oldest continuously operating woodwind manufacturer in the world. They only make bassoons and contrabassoons. That's all they do. Um, Whereas French bassoons, you had Buffet, but Buffet makes everything, and so bassoons aren't their big priority. They only make a couple a year.
Hmm.
Uh, so yeah, there's probably a lot of sociological things to talk about on that. You could probably you people I'm sure have done entire dissertations on that subject. But yeah, the the only place in the U.S. you could see them later in about 1920 was Boston. The the players in Boston did tend to use the French bassoons. Interestingly enough, the second player right now in the New York Philharmonic does play French bassoon on occasion. Um, she will bring out her French bassoon whenever it's needed. So she may be the only bassoon player in a professional orchestra in the U.S. that will actually play a French bassoon. Everybody else is German.
Gotcha. Another thing I wanted to ask you, with jazz music, sax players double on clarinet and they double on flute. Do you have any thing to say on why the bassoon never sort of made it into big band music, but why flutes and
It's not
clarinets?
loud enough. It's simply it is not loud enough to compete with saxophones, trumpets, trombones. Um, that I think that's probably the biggest reason. It's clarinet, can play high enough to be heard over all that because there's not a voice in a jazz band that it can get as high as a clarinet can.
Mhm.
Bassoon is just simply not loud enough, and it's also not as finger friendly as saxophone is. Saxophone has a much simpler technique, whereas it is to do some of the stuff on saxophone on bassoon is infinitely more difficult because there's so much more complexities involved in the fingering system on bassoon than it is on saxophone. So you don't see a lot of jazz players pick up a bassoon at all.
Yeah,
It's like, yeah, not worth it.
sure.
It can make for great jazz in small combos. There are
Mhm.
some really phenomenal jazz bassonists out there. Paul Hansen is a great one to look at. Paul Rabinowitz. There's a few others out there. Mark Ortwine, who plays contrabassoon with the Indianapolis Symphony, does a lot of jazz bassoon. A lot of people have experimented with electronic bassoon as well, putting pickups and pedal boards and all that stuff, and
Mhm.
that can work really well too.
Cool. Awesome. Well, I think we're at an hour and 32 minutes and 53 seconds. So,
Yeah. So yeah.
just in closing, is there anything else you want to say or plug or?
Um. Oh, I mean, the bassoon is so much more than just this bass instrument. I mean, I know you've talked a little bit about why Hollywood orchestrators aren't using woodwinds as much, but man, this is such a valuable addition, and I wish more modern composers could see that. It's one of the most versatile instruments in the orchestra. It can add to it, your strings, your woodwinds, your brass. Um, yeah, it does a lot. But you said if I wanted to plug anything, I do have a another size of bassoon that I've been working on, and because I am a complete madman, if that has not been made apparent, over the last 2 years I have been designing a new size of bassoon, which I happen to have here. It is not finished, but this is what we're calling the Great Bassoon. It is it's a fourth lower than the regular bassoon, and as you can see, it's ginormous. It's 6 feet 8 inches tall. It's the same height as a standard American doorway. It will, when it's completed, go down to the lowest E of a double bass, E0. No,
Yep.
E1. I'm sorry, E1. Um, and it is basically a resurrection of a lost member of the bassoon family that hasn't been around in nearly 200 years. Hopefully, sometime this year the instrument will be completed, and I'll be able to kind of give some full demonstrations on it. But yeah, that's my big bassoon related project, is resurrecting a long lost member of the family.
Awesome.
And hopefully, some composers will become interested in this, and I can get some music written for it, and maybe, who knows, people may actually, really like it. So, but we'll
Cool.
see. It's a
Awesome.
long road in the future.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been, I've learned a few things myself, and I hope those that are tuning in, have a much more intimate sense of the bassoon.
Yeah, and you've convinced me to do what I think I'm going to call the Woodwind Toolbox, where I go through all of my woodwind instruments and talk about them from a composer's point of view, where I play full range
Yeah.
slowly, so you can hear every note, and talk about some of the pitfalls in writing for those instruments. And so I think I'm going to start that series here pretty soon, and I'm going to start with
Cool.
the bassoon, then work through all the saxes and all the clarinets. And
Awesome.
sounds like I think it's going to be a fun little project.
I'd love to hear it myself. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
But
All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in, and catch you on the next one.
bye.